Well, let's take a closer look at the political state of play tonight. In the 35 Senate seats being contested, Democrats are on defense, trying to hold on to their 24 seats. Pay attention to 11 close races, some in states President Trump won big in 2016. There are also a few GOP-held seats that have become toss-ups over the course of the campaign, including open seats in Arizona and Tennessee. In the 36 governor's races today, it is the Republican Party on defense. Of the 16 closest races, 13 are held by Republicans, including in traditional conservative strongholds like Kansas and Oklahoma. But perhaps the biggest prize of this night, control of the House of Representatives. Of course, all 435 seats are up for election. Democrats need a net gain of 23 seats to win back the Speaker's gavel. We're going to be keeping track of them all, but we're going to pay particular attention to some swing districts. There are 21 seats that President Obama won in 2012 that flipped to President Trump in 2016. And 13 districts went the other way, voting for Mitt Romney in 2012 and then for Hillary Clinton in 2016. So let's get thoughts on what to watch tonight from some familiar faces here at our table who are going to be with me all this night. Syndicated columnist Mark Shields, New York Times columnist David Brooks, Amy Walter, national editor for the Cook Political Report, Karine Jean-Pierre, a senior advisor to MoveOn.org and a veteran of the Obama administration, and Chris Buskirk. He's the editor of the conservative website American Greatness. We welcome all of you. It's going to be a long night, and we're going to hang together throughout, no matter what the results tell us. David Brooks, I'm going to start with you. What are you looking for?
Well, it'll be just a pleasure to get actual results, though we'll put a crimp in my random speculations, which I've been doing the last few months. No, it will be, a couple things strike me about today. First, all the Democratic friends I have are like flinching because they're afraid, like, oh, they went in so confident 2 years ago, and now they're thinking, oh, it's going to happen again, it's going to happen again. So I've never seen such pre-vote nervousness, at least on the Democratic side. The third thing I'd say is that if there's been any movement in the polls, and maybe Amy would know this better than my sense is the last couple of days have been kind of good for the Democrats. And so if there's any, and that matters a lot because waves tend to be bigger than they look. And when there's a wave election, it's always bigger than we think it will be. So that could be, who'll know, we'll see in a few hours. And then the final thing, more than about culture, more than about legislation, this is about culture, about what kind of country we are. And the results will tell us a lot about whose story about America really is the predominant story.
So, Mark, are you nervous as David?
No. Supremely, sublimely confident. I associate myself with David's remarks, but I do think that the unwritten story, the uncovered story, not that we've covered it, but it's gone generally uncovered, are the governor's races. I mean, I think they're the most important. The Republican ascent to dominance at the congressional level began in 2010. Really, I mean, that was since then. Democrats have been competitive in votes, but not in results, because the Republicans drew the lines after the 2010 census, thanks to winning governorships across the country, but particularly in the Great Lakes Midwestern states. And that's where Donald Trump won the presidency. He carried Michigan, he carried Wisconsin, he carried Pennsylvania by a grand total of 80,000 votes among the three of them. But all three of those states tonight are poised to elect, in my judgment, Democratic governors. And I think that when you're talking about, as you did, states like Kansas, possibly voting for a Democrat tonight. Ohio, I think, a state that Trump won by 9 points. So I think in that sense, when the dust does settle going forward from 2018, looking at the 2020 census, Democrats are going to be in a far more competitive position, not simply for the 2020 election, but for drawing the congressional districts in a more equitable and just basis after that census.
Amy Walter, what about you?
I'm really struck by some of the things that these folks brought up, especially the feeling the last time we were all here in 2016. In some ways, it feels like it was about 116 years ago, but it also feels very familiar. And yet the country hasn't moved on much in their opinions about the president since 2016. Normally over the course of president's first term, he starts with the honeymoon and then kind of goes up and down, and then you see where he ends up coming into a midterm election. In this president's case, he started basically at 45% approval rating, and he's ending essentially at 44, 45%. And along the way, he's dipped a little bit here and there, and opinions of him, they haven't changed, they've just hardened. If you didn't like him in 2016, you really don't like him now. If you liked him in 2016, you still really like him now. And so what I'm going to be very curious to see is which parts of the country, as David pointed out, making sort of it's more of a cultural decision than it is on policy. And it's more personality based, and which parts of the country are going to weigh in. They weigh in differently in House races than they do in Senate races, and it looks a lot different in a midterm than it does in a presidential when electoral votes are the key as opposed to individual districts and different situations in individual states.
So, Karine Jean-Pierre, if we're ending up about where we started,
yes,
it's not as if a lot hasn't happened over the last 2 years.
Yes, what has not happened in the last 2 years, when you talk about nervous Democrats, it reminds me of the Saturday Night Live skit with the nervous Democrats. And I know a lot of friends who are feeling like that, who are just staying home and drinking by themselves. But tonight, because they don't want to. But anyway, I'm in the line with Mark on the governorships. I think that's something that we haven't heard a lot about. There are a lot of historic firsts, I think, in this election. But yes, Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, as you mentioned, we can make a lot of historic, kind of getting back some of those states and really focusing on redistricting and what that will look like in 2020. And also Florida and Georgia. If that happens, we're going to potentially elect the first African-American woman in Georgia, governor in this country, that we haven't done yet. Also the first African-American governor in Florida, which would be huge. And there are other firsts. We could potentially elect more than 100 women in Congress. And the first Native American, more women, 100 more women in Congress. The first Native American, the first Muslim woman. So there are a lot that has happened in the last 2 years. And I think it started with women, with the Women's March.
Chris Buskirk, what's your perspective? What are you keeping an eye on?
I'll tell you, when you think about just the horse race tonight, there are a few districts and there are races I think we all are going to keep our eye on. Virginia 10 or Ohio 12 or some of the Senate races. And these are bellwethers when you just think very sort of tactically what's going to happen tonight, how's it going to turn out. But the big picture thing for me is going to be Republican turnout. That's something that I think is really interesting since we're talking about the Women's March. Since the Women's March almost 2 years ago now, we've known Democrat turnout was going to be enormous. I think one of the things that maybe is set to surprise people is that Republican turnout is going to be really, really big tonight too. And so, what does that tell us? It tells us that Republican candidates and the Republican base aren't running away from Trump or the policies he's been pursuing. They're actively running with him, and so that sets up an ongoing political conflict that's going to play out in the next 2 years and probably beyond that. I mean, remember, 2 months from now in January, the presidential race starts. We're just barely going to get through Christmas,
and it starts tomorrow.
Yeah,
on Wednesday. I think you're right.
I was hoping for a Christmas
I know,
break.
you're not going to get one.
12 hours from now.
Yeah.
But I think that's a really good point about turnout. That's what's so different about this midterm from previous midterms. Usually there's a wave because one side turns out and the other side doesn't. The side that turns out usually is the party out of power, right? They're the most frustrated. They want to get back in power, and the party in power, they're either complacent or they're disappointed and they stay home. That's not what this election, certainly in what we've seen thus far, is suggesting.
I want to ask each one of you, just to go around, are we hearing from the candidates, David, the things that the voters want to hear about? Are we hearing about the things that matter in our lives?
Mark and I disagree on this one, but I think it's a big, as I mentioned last week, I think on both sides' minds, there's some sense of national unraveling. So it's not about specific issues, it's about a big sense of unraveling. And I think what Donald Trump has done is told a very coherent national story. Here's where we are, here's who the good people are, here's who the aliens who are out to get us, and that's a big comprehensive story. The Democrats have gone to the health care issue. And I personally think that's a mistake. It may not matter electorally because enough people don't like Donald Trump, but I think it's really a question of what kind of nation are we? Who's in our nation, what values do our nation represent, and Donald Trump has given a pretty coherent argument about that, and I think the Democrats have not responded with a coherent, big argument in that way.
What about that, Mark?
David was wrong a week ago, and it's one of the great things about his consistency that I've come to admire and treasure. Now, that is not a midterm election. That's a presidential election, and the president is the voice of the party. I really think that what is fascinating about this election is that the Republicans were dealt 4 kings. I mean, this economy is absolutely gangbusters. And when you've got fewer people on food stamps, when you've got more people working in manufacturing, when you've got a booming economy, and Donald Trump is a one-trick pony. He can only come back to division. He can only come back. He can't accept good news. His message basically is things are bad and they're going to get worse, and that's so he comes back to immigration, and I think in a bizarre way he's played into the Democrats' hands. I really do. I mean, but instead of saying what we accomplished, it's not only morning in America, it's weekend in America. It's a great boom, and the Democrats oppose me at every turn, and this is what we're boom, and we're going to have bigger booms, and it's going to be better tomorrow. And instead, he turns away from that and goes to fear, division, and I think to defeat.
Chris Buskirk, has the president missed the mark by talking as much as he has about immigration?
I don't think so, and here's why. I mean, I understand Mark's point, but I think what Donald Trump's looking at is that this is an issue that motivates the Republican base. If you go back to August of 2015, what was the issue that started to separate Donald Trump from the rest of the pack during the primaries? It was immigration. We started to really talk about that a lot. That propelled him forward, and the more he talks about that, the more engaged the Republican base comes. And part of it is what he really believes. So he's a conviction politician in that way on this issue. Part of it also is you go with what works. And if this is something that's important to your base, we were talking about that, or politicians talking about what's important to voters, this is important to Republican voters.
Karine, how do you see it?
So it's really unfortunate because there is an immigration problem, absolutely, and we need to fix it. And clearly Central America countries there are having real economic issue and violence there, and people there are trying to flee to save their lives. But what Donald Trump is doing is racism. It's race baiting. It's really awful. It's ugly. It shouldn't be who we are as a country. And instead of coming up with policies and trying to figure out how can we help, how can we fix, he's really just throwing red meat at his base, and it's really disturbing. And I as someone who's an immigrant myself, came here with my parents decades ago, this is not what the American dream is. This is fear-mongering, and it shouldn't be. And so that's kind of unfortunate.
Chris, do you want to respond quickly to that before I go to Amy?
Yeah, I think I appreciate your point, Karine. I think I can speak for myself. I don't want to put words in anybody else's mouth, but the perception of the immigration problem we have from the right, for myself, is that this is one of those things where you have to get control of the border first and then start to think about, well, okay, how do we fix these other things? In other words, don't let the problem of illegal immigration get worse, because there's such distrust on this issue between Democrats and Republicans. It's kind of like a drug deal at midnight. Nobody wants to go first, right? And so it's kind of like a matter of the president saying, let's build a wall, let's enforce the laws, and then we can talk about how do we deal with Central America. It's a big issue. If there was no demand for people to come here, you wouldn't have the issue at the border. So how do you help fix these other countries that are in our hemisphere that are sending people here?
So I think we're agreeing, but I think it's the lies, right? Saying that the caravan with no facts, right, are gang members, when we know majority of the folks who are in that caravan are women and young people. I think it's like saying that you're going to end the 14th Amendment, right, which is something that's really important. Take away people's birthrights who are born here. So that's the problem, is the lies and the fear mongering. It's not that we're not saying, hey, we don't need to fix the problem. There is a problem, but why connect it to lies?
We're going to come back to this and talk about it a lot more through the night. But Amy, it's emblematic of what we're looking at in this election.
Yeah, the emotional piece of this election has been clear from the very beginning, right? Literally, when the election was over in 2016, the emotion was raw, and that rawness has continued throughout until this moment. The interesting thing about the issues being brought up, for Democrats, if healthcare, I think they looked at that issue and they said, in 2016, Hillary Clinton made the contrast between Democrat and Republican, between herself and Trump, on vision of America. I'm going to be an inclusive vision of America. He's a divisive message on America. And she loses, and Democrats say she lost because she didn't talk about the economy, and this wasn't the issue that was going to motivate voters. Healthcare, pocketbook issue will. What it is setting up for, though, and this was going to come anyway, but it's certainly setting it up even more dramatically, is Democrats at some point have to get their arms around and define what Medicare for all means. For every Democrat, it means something different, and whoever the Democratic nominee is going to have to really clearly outline that. And for right now, I think that is fine that we don't have an answer, but it's going to be more challenging going forward.
We're going to come back to all of this as the night goes on.